So let's talk about this notion of sort of post-seed. I think it's really interesting what's going on. Bambi tried to get towards the idea of the bubble conversation with Peter Thiel. I don't find the bubble conversation useful because it means different things to different people, and usually people who are most interested in the notion of a bubble don't really know what they're talking about. But I do feel like there's this tremendous excitement on the seed level investing, people wanting to start companies in technology in this area like we haven't seen since 1999.
Yeah.
But the environment of funding for that seems like it's the same as it was back then, but everything after is different.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
I think so. I think it's helpful to step back and kind of look at what happened over the last 8 years or so in the startup financing world, which was basically, if you go back to post-bubble crash, the only way to get funded was basically there were let's say 10 to 20 active venture capital firms and a small group of angel investors like Ron Conway and a few other people who kept doing angel investing.
And not many.
Not many. And so like I started my first company in 2004, and we raised what would today be considered a seed round, and there were very few options. I mean, there were basically 10 VCs.
See, maybe we should define some of that too, just for you, because it means different things to different people. But seed round, what, like 2 million?
Like it was 2.5 million. But yeah, so something like in that ballpark, as opposed to 5 to 10, which would usually be like a venture round. So back then, it was very clear to me, like as an entrepreneur trying to raise money, there were basically 10-ish firms who were sort of actively investing who would consider something like we were doing. And people would just laugh today if they heard the terms. They were so onerous. They had all these things like, even with the 2 million, there was tranching, which is basically you get your money in different, over time as you hit milestones. So,
basically, so as you had payroll?
Yeah, it was like
you had to go back and ask for more money.
We called it the IV drip. It was like this sort of like, you know, and you get 500K, oh, you did this, and you have to come back and present to the partnership. We were the lucky ones. We were like the ones who got funded. So it was a very, you know, meanwhile you had all these people doing very interesting new things. So you had, you know, Delicious and Flickr and Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn, and all these people kind of building these cool new consumer startups. And some of them would get funded if they were well connected or something else. But it felt like a very great era of experimentation and innovation, and the funding didn't match that. At least that was my perception, which is why in about 2006, as Samuel mentioned, I co-founded a fund called Founder Collective. And a lot of other people had the same idea, basically. Around that time, people had the idea that, okay, there's a gap in the funding environment. There needs to be these sort of professional seed funds who are really willing to take even much more risk than the venture capitalists, and be willing to fund, you know, 3 people with a crazy idea running an experiment. And so that was great. I think that was a very good thing, I think, for the startup world, because you had a lot more people coming in. You had you kind of lowered the barriers to entry. It became more inclusive. You had things like Y Combinator, which were very important for.
And that idea really proliferated too.
Yeah, the idea. I think it was, you know, Y Combinator is a very important institution, and it really sort of sent a message out to, you know, if you're a promising student at a engineering school, you know, you might have, prior to this era, you might have thought your only options were investment banking and management consulting and, you know, whatever, working on engines at General Electric or something.
There's a reason they call it Bain.
Yeah, or Bain, yeah, exactly. So something like that. And now suddenly, I think a lot of those people said, wait, there's another option. I can go start a company. I can go to Silicon Valley. So that was great. So that happened. Meanwhile, what happened is so you had the seed fund kind of revolution happen starting in 2008-ish or something, and then you meanwhile had the big funds like I'm, you know, a partner at Andreessen Horowitz. There's, you know, Greylock and a bunch of Sequoia, a bunch of other great venture capital funds, which got bigger and bigger for a bunch of reasons. And so you basically had this sort of bifurcation. So you have the seed funds who make
a lot of money at the very beginning, suddenly.
That's right.
Or at least a lot of funders. The dollar amounts weren't, you know.
Yes.
And then a lot of money on the back end, looking to do, you know, Sequoia rounds, Kleiner rounds, D rounds, right?
Yeah, but very different money and different type of investing, different things they look for in the investments, different offerings beyond the money, like what would they do to help, and I can talk more about that in a minute. But like, so it was a very different style, and each has some advantages, disadvantages. But then what happened, I think, is partly what this conference is about, is they kind of split off, and this sort of gap emerged in between. And we see this a lot now, where there's a lot of, I guess, this conference is called post-seed, and it's about this sort of post-seed stage. We call it, internally, we call it the early A, like early Series A is our kind of just internal word for it, which is basically this kind of, you have a lot of companies that raise a seed round, perform very well, good metrics, growing, whatever metric is relevant, revenue or users or whatever type of business it is. And then they go out to raise from people like us, and I see this every day, and they come in and they show these nice graphs, and they've done, they sort of did what they said they were going to do, and from our point of view, it's sort of like we saw 20 companies like that this week, And so I think it's shocking to the entrepreneurs, because I think, frankly, it's a little of a disservice that the world or whatever community did, in that I sort of, like analogy I would use is like a video game where like the first level is like relatively easy. I'm not going to say it's easy to raise a seed round, but it's easier. And then suddenly like the next level is like, whatever, missiles firing at you and like boss mode, and like everything's just like incredibly hard. When you sort of like, it just basically jumps from relatively easy to really, really hard, which is the Series A.
Sucks to be Mario and Luigi.
It's kind of sucks. And so what I do think is happening is the market is correcting itself, and I believe the sponsors of this conference, and there's a bunch of other funds which are now being started to focus just on that stage, which is a good thing. But
so if your A round, or sorry, if your seed round is, let's call it $2 million,
yep,
and your A round's $10 million, and a fund such as yours, such as Andreessen Horowitz, doesn't want to be more than half of an A round, and probably wants to be a lot less than that. Yes.
Oh no, A round. No, we want to be the majority of the A round. Yeah.
Is that common?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty standard model, because the way that the way the seed investor thinks about it, the seed investor just wants to invest in a bunch of interesting companies in hopes that, whatever, 1 in 10, 1 in 20 even.
Spray and pray is the phrase.
That's the negative phrase. I think the more positive one would be diversification, or indexing.
That's what I meant to say. Sorry, diversification. Right.
But the idea, like the seed funds often will work if you have 1 or 2 big hits in an entire fund. Like the whole fund actually ends up being positive. Right. With the VC, and they take a very different role. They invest. They will sometimes usually help with certain maybe key inflection points, but generally are not that involved. Don't join the board. Whereas VCs, we often join the board. We put lots of, at Andreessen we have 100-ish people. I don't know the exact number right now, who are not investors, who are operating partners, who help with recruiting and business development and a whole bunch of other activities. So we kind of like think of it as like we're putting this whole kind of army behind you, and as a result, we want to invest as much as we can in the round.
So you guys will famously put your companies in front of potential customers, and you'll also help them with marketing and PR.
Yeah. So we have a whole floor. If you come to our office in Menlo Park, the first floor is devoted to what we call the Executive Briefing Center, where we'll have 2,000 large companies, CIOs, CTOs, in the office this year, meeting with startups. It's a phenomenal service.
So this leads to my question. So what is it that is there fair to say there's a thing that companies need in the middle, that on a managerial or a sort of business performance level, that is more than the seed investor who dropped the money off and checks in once in a while, and the board member of an A round? What do those companies need in that sort of spot in the middle?
So I think what we see is that there's a set of kind of fairly standardized metrics, for example, that people like us would be expecting at a Series A, depending on the type of company. And it varies very. So if you're e-commerce versus like consumer internet versus enterprise, they're going to be very different metrics. But there's a set of kind of metrics, and I think one of the services that VCs and other professional investors provide is kind of giving steady guidance on whether the company is hit. Like I think what happens now is people raise seed rounds. They have 30 small investors in what they call a party round, which is a bunch of people putting a little bit of amount, and they go out and they perform. They think they're doing well, but they don't understand the metrics that they're going to be used, that are going to be they're going to be judged upon. So I think what these good kind of early A, post-seed investors do is they provide money, but they also provide kind of guidance to get the company to the next phase.
Are there things, though, about the businesses that they sort of have a series of common problems, or because all businesses are different, all problems are different?
A lot of commonality. I mean, I think probably recruiting is the biggest pain point we see right now. Recruiting engineers is just brutal. It's I don't know of a company that doesn't have dozens of openings for the recruiting side. This proliferation of startup funding and startups has probably exacerbated that problem. Because what happens is, if you're a very talented engineer, you're sort of saying, should I go start my own company and own whatever it is, 30% of it or something, or join somebody else and own 2%, or I don't know, I'm just making up the numbers, but something in those ballparks. And so anyway, so just recruiting in general, we have our immigration policies. We basically go and we educate lots of people and then send them back to their home country to create companies.
Good luck,
so,
yes.
Yeah, so it's
John Doerr's been arguing for years we should be stapling a green card to every diploma.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I'd agree with him. But
it looks, well, maybe we're getting closer with what the president did last week. It's just not all that popular in some circles. But when we talk about the reluctance of your firm, well, talk to me about that. Your firm's desire to be in the seed level and the problems that creates. Is part of it, when I was a portfolio manager at a hedge fund, I managed $250 million of a particular kind of investment, but I couldn't really handle more than 25 or 30 investments because I couldn't know everything about the 31st company. Mm-hmm. Is that part of the limitation for you guys? Is just being able to keep a handle on all those companies?
There's basically three approaches that large VCs have to seed funding. I think, well, maybe basically two approaches. One is to do very small investments, like $50,000, which for a fund of our size is small. And then to be pretty hands-off. That's actually what we used to do. We, about a year ago, switched to doing what I would call more traditional seed investing, which is, so this year we've done about 30 seed investments. All of them have been ones where we've led the round, where we've invested at least $1 million, where we've bought some percentage ownership of the company that we think is meaningful, where we're actively involved in the company, where we're putting resources and recruiting and business development, everything else behind the company. So there's different models. Other firms do these things where they, kind of what we used to do, which is to write very small, like $50,000 checks and then just sort of like sit back and wait and see if they do well. But certainly though that when you, in our business, the biggest constraints are the time and resource, the sort of the time we have and all of our partners have to help the companies.
What about, from your standpoint as a fund, conflict with other businesses you may or may not be invested in yet?
Yeah, so that's the other big difference between us, like big VCs, and seed funds. Seed funds generally don't worry about conflicts. They're able to invest in multiple, frankly, they have to, because early stage companies pivot and change businesses so often that even if you tried to not invest in competing companies, you often would. So seed funds generally don't have that constraint. We do have this constraint, which is we only invest in one company per category. Now, sometimes companies pivot and change, and you can't control that. And sometimes, how do you define a category when an emerging, Internet of Things, or if you pick it, Bitcoin, or whatever the space is, it's sometimes, what is considered competitive changes over time.
It starts off as one thing and splinters into a dozen.
Yeah, exactly. So it's very hard to sort of say, but generally, because like if we're inviting you in to meet the CTO of Citibank and pitch your security software, we don't want to have your direct competitor also sitting there, right? So we want to have, especially because of all the services we provide, we want to make sure. So that's a big constraint on our business, is to invest in sort of non-competitive companies.
Pretty early on.
And that generally all of the sort of good VCs have that constraint. And I think it's a much bigger constraint than people realize. Than I realized until I joined Andreessen Horowitz.
Well, it's going to be hard because you don't know how the category is going to splinter.
We don't know, We don't know, and I would say it ends up being like a significant portion of the investments we don't make are due to the fact that we think there either is or will be a conflict.
I do want to get to questions if people have them, and I would ask you to line up at the microphones by the thousands, or not at all. But I have more than enough to talk about. And I don't want to get too lost in the weeds, but I've been doing a lot of work lately just kind of looking at not just, in a deal there's the price and then there's the terms.
Yep.
And I feel like there's a great focus on the price because that's something that's easy for people who don't think too much to think about. But the terms, I wonder how much terms differ, how they differ between rounds, and particularly in this round above the seed and before the A, what those terms, what the best of terms and the worst of terms might look like.
Yep. Yeah, so it's interesting because in the 90s, there were, and actually in the crash, terms got very onerous. So there's all these things like participating preferences, multiple liquidation preferences, particularly in the, I think in the year of 2001 through 4,
Well, and you saw it in the public markets too. I mean,
Yeah,
you call it participating preferences. In the market, they call it a resettable convertible, or they call it a toxic reset, which said that if you bought 10% of a company at $100 million valuation, so you spent $10 million on it, and the valuation of the company falls by half, you now own 20% of the company, and everyone else is getting squeezed out.
Yeah, I mean, my feeling is, okay, so, well, a couple things I'll say. One is, I think one of the reasons Silicon Valley works well is that we don't have sophisticated financial engineering, is that it's very simple, which is you buy equity, and, you know, as an investor, you buy equity, and, you know, I have the exact same interests as the founders, as the employees, and we're all sort of, you know, have very similar incentives. Now, there's obvious differences. We have a diversified portfolio, et cetera. But for the most part, it's relatively simple, relatively straightforward. Once you start adding in layers of these, you know, kind of the East Coast, Wall Street, you know, multiple liquidation preferences, what you have is you start getting all these.
Said one recovering New York or two.
I know. So, but it's like that's what sort of the financial engineering, when the sort of this stuff comes in. What you end up having is basically all these situations, and I've seen this directly, where, you know, like, so what multiple liquidation preference means. So like if you have a 3x preference, that means if I put $1 in, I get $3. I get the best of the max function of either $3 or my percentage ownership. And basically, if you start graphing this out, what this means is that different exit values, you basically have sort of forking incentives between the investors, between different classes of investors, and between those investors and the founders. And so you get all sorts of weird situations where, like,
so you do see this. You're saying Silicon Valley works because we don't see it, but we do.
Well, we don't. So generally, like, we have never. I believe I could say that in the 2 years I've been at Andreessen Horowitz, I've never seen us issue a term sheet with it didn't have that had anything non-standard. So we don't do it, and I don't think any of our peers do it. But when you start seeing these later stage investors do later, you know, these kinds of effectively public rounds, the $1 billion, $2 billion plus, a lot of those things will have those things, and also a lot of those investors play by different rules. Where, so like to us, a signed term sheet, while not legally binding, is probably de facto legally binding. If you will not see a top VC firm back out of a signed term sheet unless there's discover some like material misrepresentation, like fraud type stuff. Like, it just doesn't happen because our reputation would be torched, because entrepreneurs need to depend on having signed that and telling other investors to go away. You will see with these other, what we call the retrade, which is the, you know, I don't know, I want to name names, but these later stage funds will sign term sheets and then retrade, meaning they'll say, oh, I didn't tell you about this multiple liquidation preference. And then meanwhile, the entrepreneur's like, wait, what's up with that? I just told the other 5 bidders to go away. Now, if I back out, they're going to think I'm damaged goods.
So you're talking about the non-Silicon Valley investors.
That's right.
I will cite names that I've been told don't do this, but like we've seen like funds like Fidelity come in, or T. Rowe Price or Tiger, the great big hedge fund in New York, come in and make some very late round investments in companies like Uber, and I've been told specifically that those are straight deals where they own the same kind of.
I think those, the ones you mentioned, would not be doing this stuff. But this does happen, and so there's all, you know, once you get outside of, because like in Silicon Valley, it's a very tight knit group. Like, if you do something everybody knows about it. A lot of it runs on reputation, and once you start getting these people from outside of that world who don't care about that.
You do have like Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, like making very early round investments in certain companies. Now, are they following
occasionally? Yeah, occasionally you do, but you don't see them going to. I mean, I've seen 1 or 2 cases where they've gone to like Series A or B, but not many. Maybe we'll see more. That'll be interesting to see. Right now, they've gotten into like the Series D or something. If they start coming into Series A and B, we'll see. I think, you know, our feeling is that Series A and B, you need investors who have started companies and have been entrepreneurs, but you know,
beware the vampire squid. You got a question there?
Yeah, Josh Constantine from TechCrunch. A lot of the bubbliness chat has focused around consumer mobile apps and social apps in particular. And Mark Andreessen said that it's sort of like finding lightning in a bottle to invest in these startups. What do you guys look for besides traction for consumer apps when you're looking and deciding whether to invest? And how has that criteria changed over the last year as we sort of hit the attention bandwidth limit for our use of mobile apps?
That's a great question. I think so. I would say, so for me, consumer breaks down into multiple areas. So, for example, we did Oculus as an investment. Before, they had sold pre-sales and they had some, but they didn't have, you know, it wasn't like Snapchat kind of growth, and we did that before, you know, pretty early on and before they had kind of breakout traction. We did it because they had what we thought was a breakthrough technology. So I think we need to see, I think the way I think about it is we want to see something that we think is really differentiated and breaking out. And so if it's something, it could either be something that's like a real breakthrough technology, or it could be breakthrough traction, which would be sort of like, the Snapchat, the consumer social kind of stuff tends to be there. The social one in particular is very, very crowded. I think if you looked at, if you kind of look at the funnel, so to speak, of like seed-funded companies to breakouts, there's a lot of seed-funded social, consumer social things, and it is very hard early on to pick the winners. A lot of these things, I think, it's because like Snapchat's a wonderful application. There probably are 50 other wonderful applications like Snapchat that didn't take off, because as you know, these things have network effects. There's once all the cool friends are using it, you're more likely to use it. How exactly that process starts is very, it's sort of a nebulous and complicated thing. And so I would say it varies. I think also, like, for example, marketplaces are one where we have a bunch of investments where we'll invest pretty early on in a lot of those. If we start to see in a marketplace business, it could be a pretty small numbers, but like, you think about these things like Instacart and, there's a bunch of others, but like is
Instacart a marketplace business?
Well, it is in the sense that you have, it's in the same sense that sort of Uber is, in the sense that you have workers, supply and demand, with those, I think for each category there's a different metric for what means it's working. And with marketplaces, you could have it working, for example, in one city or in one, sort of, I don't know what, demographic or something like this, and you could see this flywheel working, and you can then imagine that it might work in other places, as an example. So it varies. I agree with you. The consumer social apps in particular is a particularly, like, I think it's become like, because partly the social apps has become like the new, American dream. Every kid in LA now is like, instead of writing a book, and then it was like, in the 50s it was a book, in the 80s it was like a TV show, and now they're dreaming up apps or something, and they're getting funded, and there's a million of them, and it's like everyone's got an idea. It's the kind of thing where you're on like I go to like family visit and Thanksgiving, and my uncle has an app idea, right? So like, I don't know, like, so.
What was his idea?
It's like, I don't know.
Come on.
Tinder for something, or I don't remember what it was.
The Tinder of Ubers?
So, anyways.
What kind of money do you think entrepreneurs? I'm thinking of like the dangerous fruit, right? Like what kind of money is bad news for entrepreneurs that you see entrepreneurs make bad
in terms of
decisions accepting money?
Oh, I think I want to put this all in context. It's generally great. Like, as an entrepreneur, you're generally struggling to survive and to raise money, and generally, like, when I was an entrepreneur, I was always of the view that all money is good to have. Basically you just want to have money in the bank and not go to business.
Green, yeah.
Yes, and so within that context, I think like it's all good to have. I think it's important to, to the extent, and I guess I'm speaking selfishly here, but I think to the extent you have people who are former entrepreneurs kind of around you, I think to the extent that you have a single one or two, let's say, investors with meaningful investments who will actually like pick up your phone call and talk to you. You'd be surprised how many of these sort of party round type things where you have lots of small investors, like literally no one will like respond. I think if you ask, like I think Sam Altman said the other day that they've run the numbers at YC, and that whenever there's a board member or a lead investor, the companies generally perform much better. So I think to the extent you can get people involved who care about what you're doing and have some advice, that's great. That said, like the reality of being an entrepreneur is you're always kind of hustling and trying to make sure you don't run out of money. So,
what do you got?
Some of your investments, a lot of the ones that people talk about, Lyft, Airbnb, even Zenefits recently was talked about. They have some legal challenges in Utah with rebatement, and even Tesla's running into these problems with the dealership model. So you're seeing a lot of like hot companies that are really regulation busters, so to speak. And what's your investment outlook on? You look at these investments and you see that, okay, they are flaunting or in a gray area of regulation, but is that something that's encouraging, or what's your general point of view, because you seem to make a bunch of those investments?
Well, I think, so my personal view is that there are two types of regulations. There's regulations that are, like clean water, seems like a no-brainer, everyone supports that. We wouldn't invest in a company that
dirty water's out?
We're not investing in dirty water.
I don't know,
I think there are other, I think there,
business.
so I think there's a significant portion of my own view is I'm not sort of a hardcore libertarian or something. I think that there's a significant number of regulations which are important and which need to be respected by everyone, including startups. I think there is a set, I think like, the taxi one would be a poster example where A lot of the regulations do not seem to be to protect consumers, and do not, they seem to be to protect incumbents. The Tesla stuff with the dealerships, that just seems like, I mean, flagrantly, a law to protect car dealerships. So to me, it varies a lot. I think in the case of Zenefits, I think they're providing what's clearly is a positive consumer service.
In the background, Zenefits, software as a service. They came up against it in Utah.
Yeah.
Because it's human resources software, basically.
Yeah, and there's a law in Utah which is basically just protecting the existing insurance brokers, and I don't think anyone even with a straight face pretends that it does anything but that. And I think I think ultimately people. It's interesting. Like with Uber, it's interesting. Like with Uber and Lyft and these things, it's interesting that because people have used these services, they just know that they're good, and like it just takes you 5 minutes to use it. And like you've got a rating on the driver. I lived in New York for a long time. I love New York. The cabs there, it's like Crazy Taxi, right? It's like you're like dodging the fire hydrant and stuff. Like it's like a video.
I was a cab driver in New York.
You were a cab driver.
So
okay. Well, sorry, I don't mean to insult cab drivers.
Easy.
But like it's just clearly it's a better system to have like a reputation system and all the things that you would expect in these modern applications. I think with the consumer one, it's sort of it's easier for consumers to see the benefit and realize the regulation is there just to protect the incumbents. I think where you run into much more difficult challenges is in areas like healthcare, where it's so complicated, it's so confusing. It's very easy to think that everything the FDA does is protecting you from some terrible drug. If you talk to, I don't know a single person who's an entrepreneur in healthcare who thinks that the FDA, is doing a good job. So they would say it's basically killed off all innovation. We don't invest, for the most part, we don't invest in FDA-regulated companies, and nor do almost any other Silicon Valley VCs because the regulations are so onerous. Imagine if every time you released a version, Apple released a new OS build, they had to go through a 4-year regulatory process, right? You just can't do the kind of innovation that we're used to doing, where you do iterative releases. If every time you do it, you have to have you have to prove scientifically that there's absolutely never ever going to be a problem. It's just not how the innovation process works. So you're right, though. I think as this era of technology is much more about. It seems to be that the core theme is about moving beyond bits to atoms, and meaning technology that affects the real world and transportation and housing and healthcare and all these other things, as opposed to just moving bits around. And those areas tends to be much more heavily regulated, and it probably will become. I think this issue is only beginning to be significant, and will probably be the defining issue of the next decade in technology, I think.
Well, luckily we've got a Congress that is able to get things done. Washington functioning very well, so we're in good shape. We're also out of time.
Well-oiled machine.
Chris Dixon, Andreessen Horowitz, thank you very much.
All right, thank you.